So as we begin this morning, I want to invite you just to think about a time where maybe you felt desperate. A situation where it seems like so many things that are outside of your control are somehow in control of you and your future. I think for a lot of people, everything that's happened with COVID has induced many such moments. That they wouldn't articulate it this way, but the reality is so much of their security is placed in the things that they have that they thought it would never be taken away from them. And then everything happens, there's lockdowns and there's shutdowns, there's all these things, and all of a sudden it's like, well, my health and my job or even my house and my security, like none of those things are guarantees, and so it makes them feel a little bit desperate. For me, when I think about like desperate moments of my own life, the story that comes to my mind is my daughter Abby's birth, which many of you know, and I'll spare some of the details, but there was some complications with the pregnancy, and so we knew that if Kate went into labor, that there was a potential, it was potentially dangerous for both mom and for baby. And so no problem, so we scheduled the C-section to take care of all of that, scheduled in advance, it was all good. But then nonetheless, even before that scheduled time came, was woken up in the middle of the night, Kate is going into labor, and all of a sudden there's this, this ticking clock going by. There's danger for both my wife and for my child. And to make matters worse, I was already a little sick that evening, so I wasn't like totally feeling myself. I remember going and dropping Philip off at my friend's house in the middle of the night, then trying to get over to the hospital. To make things worse, there was a blizzard that night, and to get to the hospital, you had to go into technically a different town. You had to drive over this icy bridge. I remember going like as fast as I could, but trying to be as safe as I could, knowing like time mattered, but at the same time, like the conditions were bad. And in that moment, I felt a little desperate. I felt like there were things that were outside of my control that were in control of my future. And I don't think I've ever prayed as hard as I prayed in that moment driving on that bridge. It's amazing sometimes how desperation can have one of two effects. Either it can drive us away from God, or it can be properly used and drive us towards Him. Of course, that story ends with a happy ending. As we made it, they took a look at Kate, they assured us everything was going to be fine, and then obviously Kate and Abby are both happy and healthy today. But in today's passage, we are also going to meet two people who are very desperate, who really have a situation where nothing can be done for them. There's one woman who is incurably ill, and then there's this guy who's got a daughter whose daughter's incurably, dead, and both are very desperate. Both run to Jesus. Both witness a miracle in their lives. And what these two stories that they teach us is that when we are desperate, we need to come to Jesus with faith and experience His salvation. So 2 weeks ago, when we were last in Mark, we had Serve Your City last week, we saw two miracle stories. There was the calming of the sea, and there was Jesus casting out the legion of demons. Both of those miracles, though, despite the wonders that Jesus did, were met with fear instead of with faith, and we talked about the consequences of that. Well, that prepares us for today's passage where we receive two more miracle stories, but this time people are going to be responding with faith instead of fear, and we're going to see the difference that can make. This, by the way, is also going to be another example of the bracketing or sandwiching technique that Mark so often uses. It was a very common literary device when the Gospels were written. And what the author does, he starts a particular story, gets partway through it, and then all of a sudden interrupts that with another story. Usually in the narrative, there's some sort of time gap that's being filled there. And then it comes back to the first story and resolves it. So whenever we see that in the Gospels, what we're supposed to do is take a look at those two stories, compare them and contrast them, and that brings out the main message that the author wants us to perceive. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to break down each part of this gospel sandwich. We're going to start with that bottom slice of bread. The story's going to be interrupted, and we'll have the meat, and then we'll come back and conclude the first story with that top slice of bread. And so the story begins with that bottom slice of bread where Jairus needs a miracle. We're in Mark chapter 5 at verse 21. It says, "When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. And then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live.' And he went with him." So now Jesus has returned from Gentile territory. If you remember from the previous passage, there was the crowd pressing around, and Jesus kind of wants to expand the ministry to Gentile territory. So they sail across to the Gennesaret, which is the Gentile area. Jesus works this great miracle where he casts out this legion of demons out of a guy. but for his good deed, he has actually ran out of town. So now they pop back in the boat, they cross back to the other side, and there, sure enough, for Jesus is waiting the crowd. The crowd, always there for Jesus. The crowd, such a mixture of faith, but also maybe some confusion and misunderstanding about who Jesus is. As the crowd presses around Jesus, one man emerges. We are told his name is Jairus, and he is called one of the rulers of the synagogue. So a ruler of the synagogue, that was an elected position where the person was to take care of the synagogue, which is a Jewish house of worship, if you didn't know that. So he'd take care of the buildings, and he would preside over services. It was considered an important title. Like, Jairus is a big deal. In fact, one of the reasons that it seems that Jairus gets to Jesus so easily is because of that title. The crowd is such a constant obstacle for anyone who tries to get close to Jesus throughout all of Mark. But probably the crowd saw Jairus and they got out of the way. Make way for the ruler of the synagogue. But Jairus has not come in his pride. He has come because he's hopeless. His daughter is ill to the point of death. No one can save her. He's desperate. And so he falls down at the feet of Jesus and humbly begs, Jesus, will you lay your hands on my daughter so that she may be made well and live? I want to note for us that the term there in the ESV in verse 23 translated as made well is actually not the typical term for made well or the typical term for healed that we would expect. The Greek word is actually the word for saved. And throughout the New Testament, very popular word, and it's used in its theological sense, that we are saved from the ultimate thing that we need to be saved from, which is sin and death and judgment. That's the fullness of salvation that Jesus brings. Now, I don't think Jairus means all of that when he comes to Jesus. And in a sense, it is a life and death situation. And the word isn't totally out of place or out of context, but it's not the word we would expect. And I point it out because Mark is actually going to use that word 3 times in this passage. It's a theme that he wants to key us in on of what salvation really is. Because what's happening here is as Jesus is working these miracles, he is giving us and dropping us these little hints about what it means to experience the full salvation of God. That when the kingdom comes, it brings salvation over everything. Yes, over disease, as we'll see. Yes, even over death, as we see. But ultimately, it is salvation over the thing that causes all of that, which is sin. That is the salvation that Jesus brings. And as he works these miracles, he is giving everybody a little bit of taste about what it means to enter into the kingdom of God. Now, we should also note that Jairus coming to Jesus is also no small deal. It took great courage, and it took faith. Because there's this growing opposition to Jesus, especially against him from the religious elite, especially against the scribes, the Pharisees. So Jairus is risking his very lofty position by coming to Jesus. But then again, he is desperate. In his desperation, though, it doesn't turn him to despair. Instead, he allows his desperation to drive him into faith. And so he comes to Jesus, believing that Jesus can and will heal. And so Jesus looks at the man, sees his heart. Jesus is filled with compassion as usual, and he agrees. He says, let's go to her. They begin their journey, but then all of a sudden this journey is going to be interrupted. Verse 24, in the middle of it, there's a little cliffhanger there, right? That story ends, and it's not going to be resolved all the way until we get down to 35, and we pick back up on that, which takes us then to the meat part of our sandwich, the middle part, where this bleeding woman is healed. So we're in the middle of verse 24, and it says, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garment, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. So now we're introduced to this woman who has a discharge of blood for an incredible 12 years. Think about what that means. I mean, this is a very serious situation for a lot of reasons. Number one would be the health concern, right? Bleeding for 12 years, that's no small deal. And depending on how severe that blood is, that might even be life-threatening at this point. Another thing that makes this serious is that means it's very unlikely that she can have kids. That's very unlikely that she can get married. Which, people wrestle with today, and it's a big deal today, but we can't even fathom what that meant for her then and in that culture, in that time place. It's like she's been robbed of her God-given purpose in life. And the third reason this is a big deal is because now she is also ceremonially and ritually unclean. So it's kind of like the leper from earlier in Mark, right, where he's kind of an outcast. He's cut off from everybody else because everybody that he touches also becomes unclean. That's the situation that she is. She is also isolated, and so understandably, she is desperate. And in her desperation, the first thing she does, she turns to human sources. It says that she suffered much under many physicians. I'm not going to lie to you, I don't really know what procedures they would have offered to try to help this woman, and I'm certainly not going to take the time to Google it and find out, but without the advances of modern medicine, I think we can guess, yeah, she's probably suffered a great deal. And despite all that suffering, it didn't help. In fact, it says that it's made it worse. And now it's even worse because now she is bankrupt. She has spent everything she had. That despite their failings, it seemed the doctors were still perfectly fine taking her money. Mark says she has spent all that she has. She is desperate indeed. Everything is at stake for her. She has tried every human resource. No penny has been spared in her attempt to be healed. And who can blame her for that? But they all failed. No one can do anything for her. Her situation is hopeless. And one has to wonder, in her situation being unclean, is there even anyone around her to actually hear her out and to even care? That's tragic. But then she hears about Jesus. And all of a sudden, hope is restored. This is the man who has healed person after person, who has compassion, so he heals so many. Now, the woman surmises that Jesus is so powerful that his power just kind of exudes out of him and affects everything he touches, including his clothes. So she concludes in verse 28, if I touch even his garment, I will be made well. Note again that made well is actually the word for being saved. This woman, she does not see Jesus as a healer. She sees Jesus as a Savior, and that is what she really needs. The problem is getting to Jesus is going to be no easy feat. The crowd constantly presses around him. How's she going to get to him? I mean, sure, the crowd might move for someone like Jairus. No one's going to move for somebody like her. And so she decides what she's going to have to do is she's going to have to sneak through the crowd. But this is risky. What happens if she gets caught? She has risked making everybody around her ritually and ceremonially unclean. That's not a small deal. If she managed to weave her way through the crowd, get all the way to Jesus, and then touch his garment, guess what she's done? She's risked making him unclean. But she's desperate. There are repercussions if she gets caught, but she has no choice. She has no alternative. She has no options. So in desperation, she goes. Imagine the scene for a minute with this woman. Putting on a robe, pulling a hood over in order to disguise her identity. Beginning to try to weave her way through the crowd, never moving so fast as to draw attention to herself, but never moving so slow that she would miss out on her original goal, which is just get close to Jesus. Knowing that the stakes are hard, her heart pounding inside of her chest, and probably thoughts of fear and doubt creep into her head. Just turn back. It's not worth it. He probably can't heal you anyway. Just go away and forget about it. But she turns to faith in her desperation. Instead of to despair, pushes out the fear, pushes out the doubt, and says, no, I just need to get close to Jesus. And then as she weaves her way through the crowd, there he is. There he is, the person she sees not just as healer, but as Savior. So very subtly, very quickly and quietly, she just extends one hand, brushes against his robe, and instantly she is cured. So in tune with her body, she knows that it has already happened. She has been completely healed. Just from that touch of that robe, that all of these physicians tried everything they had. They couldn't do anything for her. And yet here is Jesus, able to heal her seemingly with no effort at all. Mission accomplished. There's only one thing left to do, and that's to get away. And so she begins to slink back into the crowd, working her way for a quiet escape. But we read on. It says in verse 30, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see how the crowd is pressing around you? And yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. So Jesus seems aware of what happened, so he stops the disciples. He stops the crowd. He stops the speedy procession to save Jairus' daughter and says, hey, who touched my garment? Mark, who is always brutally honest about the disciples, has them giving a very angry and sarcastic response. They say, you see how the crowd is pressing around you, yet you say you touched me. In other words, they're saying, how would we know, Jesus? Who touched you? Probably like a dozen people in the last minute, man. Like, the crowd is everywhere. And listen, we got places to go. We got things to do. We don't want to stop every time you think somebody nicked your robe, man. Like, let's get a move on. But Jesus knows. He knows this is about more than just someone touching his robe. This is about a person who is in the crowd and is scared, whose faith had given her a healing, and Jesus wants to give her a greater grace still. Jesus wants her to know that he isn't going to shame her, push her aside, or condemn her uncleanliness. No, he wants her to leave, not skulking away in a crowd with some guilt or with some shame about what she's done, but with a blessing from the healer. And so the movement stopped. Jesus refuses to go on until someone comes forward. He continues to look into the crowd, and the woman knows what she must do. She's had faith already in order to come to Jesus. Now her faith is being tested. Will she have a greater faith to step out in public and see what Jesus will do? And so, trembling with fear, she comes out and she falls at the feet of Jesus, and she confesses it all to him. Her sickness, her brokenness, her desperation, her risking making everybody unclean, including Jesus, she lays it all at Jesus' feet. Come what will, she confesses to the Lord. And Jesus does not shame her. He does not ridicule her. He does not push her aside, but he accepts her confession, and he adds to her a blessing. First, he says, daughter, your faith has made you well. See, it's really important that she understands that it wasn't because she touched the robe. The robe doesn't have any magical properties that are being affected because Jesus touches different things. No, it's her faith. Her faith is what made her well. And she took action on that faith. That is why she received the miracle. This, by the way, is the third time that the term has been used. Made well. And once again, it is not the term for being healed. It is the term for being saved. See, the intentional use of this term by Mark is an invitation for us to see salvation comes through faith. That's how we receive it. Now, faith healed her, but Mark wants us to know that faith offers us the greatest healing of all. It offers us a healing from the things that we really need healed from, which is sin. It's a reminder that no matter how desperate we might be in our physical circumstances, we are far more desperate for the grace of God. We are reminded that he created us. He blessed us. He loved us. And all that we did for that is reject him by choosing our sin over and over and over again. We have no business coming to church and asking for God's mercy or worshiping his holy name. We should be pushed away from the Lord and cast out. But because Jesus died on the cross for our sin and was raised to give us a newness of life, we can receive salvation. It's through faith that we receive that. It is not received without faith. Jesus adds to the woman, he says, go in peace. Peace is not a mere parting word. It's a blessing. The Jewish concept of peace, shalom, it's a whole peace. It's body, mind, and spirit. Jesus doesn't want to send her away with guilt or shame back into the crowd, but with peace. Indeed, her faith has truly made her well. One has to wonder, though, what it's kind of like to be Jairus in this situation. Right? You're trying to rush Jesus because, the situation is very serious. We don't know how long the daughter has. And then all of a sudden, Jesus stops the crowd and like, hey, someone touched my robe. Come on, man. Like, we got to go. But then this woman comes forward, and it's clear that she has received a miracle through faith. And Jairus having to ask himself, like, okay, I've had faith to come to Jesus and to bring him to my house. Will I also be rewarded for my faith? But we have to hurry, Jesus. Like, time is crucial. And so the story comes into the final part, the top part of our sandwich, back to the bread, where Jairus receives his miracle. Where verse 35, it says, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the rulers of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. He allowed no one to follow him except for Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and he took the father and the mother and those who were with him and went in to where the child was. So before this journey resumes back to Jairus' house, even while Jesus is still speaking, it says some people come from Jairus' house to dissuade him from his quest. And they bring sad news. Your daughter is dead. Now, they are no doubt probably a little irked that Jairus went to Jesus at all, but this is their chance to at least get him back in line. Why trouble the teacher any further? Because you know what? He's a teacher. There's nothing a teacher can do for the dead. So Jairus, he came with great faith to Jesus. But now he's got a problem. He's got to persevere in it. Which I think if you and I are being honest this morning, that's the hardest part of faith, isn't it? It's not having an initial faith in one moment. It's the persevering in faith when it's tested. Because faith will be tested. Now Jesus offers him some words of encouragement to keep him going. He says, do not fear, only believe. It would sure be hard to obey those words, though, in that moment. Put yourself in this man's shoes. His daughter is dead. It's too late. Yet there's Jesus who seems so self-assured. If faith has worked one miracle already, can it still work a miracle for him even still? It's a reminder for us that faith does not come without tests. The woman earlier, she had faith to come to Jesus and be healed, but then she had to have a greater faith to come out in public and confess what she had done. And Jairus had a great faith to come to Jesus, but now it's being tested by the news his daughter is dead. And all of the doubt that's coming from the people of his own house. The tests of faith come. And Jairus has more tests even still. It says that they get to the house that mourners have already gathered to weep and to wail at the loss of this young girl. Surely it's over. Surely Jesus is going to see this crowd. He's going to turn around and head back. But he doesn't. Instead, he calls them out and he asks them why they are weeping and wailing and says that she is not dead, but she is only asleep. The crowd laughs at him. No one's siding with Jesus on this one. Hey, everyone knows what death is. You know what? Dead is dead, and that girl is dead, and there's nothing anyone can do about that. But Jesus said she's sleeping. Sleeping, true enough, was a common metaphor then, and sometimes is used now, as a metaphor for death. But Jesus is using it in a way to say that he could easily wake her from that sleep. That to them, death is something that's so permanent. But for Jesus, it's something that's temporary and very fixable. And so Jairus has to hold on to his faith, has to ignore the laughing and go with Jesus. And so Jesus takes Jairus, he takes the mother of the child, he takes only 3 disciples with him and says, let's go see what faith can do. Verse 41, it says, taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking. She was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and he told them to give her something to eat. So Jesus walks over to the girl's lifeless body. She is indeed dead. She's not just sleeping. But to Jesus, death is just a sleep to be woken from. And he says to her, little girl, I say to you, arise, grabs her by the hand, and she gets up. And she's healed instantly, completely, and all is suddenly made well. Now Mark gives us a little bit of extra detail, trying to pull us into the story. Things that will help remind us that this is not an allegory. It is not a myth. In fact, that actually the reason that Mark has these details is because it comes from an eyewitness account. Hence, Mark takes the time to report the actual Aramaic words used, Talitha cumi. It's not because the words are magical, it's because those are the words that Jesus would have said. That we got to remember, like our New Testament is written in Greek. Jesus probably knew some Greek, for sure knew some Hebrew, but the spoken language that he used every day was Aramaic. These are common words, not magical words. He wants us to see the simple ordinariness of it. That he just walked up and said, hey, little girl, why don't you go ahead and get up? And boom, it was done. He adds the detail that he also instructed that the girl be fed, which again shows it was an eyewitness account, but also is a reminder that this is a physical healing. That the people of the day, they believed that if you were a spirit or a ghost, you couldn't eat. And so Jesus is inviting them, go ahead and feed the girl so you can see that this is a real miracle that has taken place. She is alive, physically, completely, and she is well. Mark adds those details to pull us into the power of that moment. Jesus then resumes what is his regular habit of silencing the people about the miracles. Likely, again, this is to keep his ministry about only being about miracles, which certainly could happen if you can raise people from the dead. It's likely also to help prevent misunderstandings about the Messiah until he shows himself to be the suffering servant on the cross. I think maybe in this case it's also just to buy a little bit of time. Don't tell anybody until I've made my way out. This crowd is never going to let me leave after I did that. After all, how long can it really be kept a secret that this girl was dead and is now alive? They made the statement themselves. She is dead and nothing could have been done for her. And so the scene closes and Jairus gets his miracle. He came to faith in Jesus, and then he had to have the faith to persevere but was rewarded abundantly for it. And so like the woman, he was also desperate. No human measure could help him. But instead he put his faith in Jesus. Instead of in despair, his faith led him to a miracle. Now these two stories are brought together in Mark for us to compare and contrast so that we may learn from them. And again, when the stories are woven together, it invites us to consider our own desperation. It invites us to consider our own need to come to Jesus with faith. And it invites us to see what Jesus can really do for you and me. That when we are desperate, we need to come to Jesus with faith and experience his salvation. Let's take a moment, though, and let's break down this thought, how we see it in the story and how we apply it to our own lives. The first thing this means for us is, you know what? We need to know that we are desperate. See, both cases, the people are incredibly desperate. As I joked earlier, the woman is incurably ill and the daughter is incurably dead. There's nothing that anybody can do for them, and yet their desperation drives them to faith instead of despair. And the reality is desperation can do the same for me and for you. In fact, I would argue we need to be a little bit desperate. Now, for some of us, that's a very small hurdle to clear. We're very desperate indeed. And we find ourselves in physical situations where we say, you know what? Things are outside of my control and they are in control of me. So all I can do is cry out to Jesus. And that is the right move in such a situation. If you are desperate, cry out to Jesus. Let that despair turn it into faith. For others of us, though, that's a little bit harder for us. Because here, with all the comforts that we have here in America, we're very good at controlling all of the variables. Or at least thinking that we are. We fool ourselves into saying it's our money, it's our values, it's our work and our wit, and that's been enough. We call ourselves strong people who don't like to rely on anybody else. And if we're being honest, most of the time we don't have to. And so it's hard for us to feel very desperate. But let us be reminded that like Jairus, no matter how privileged we might be, you still need Jesus. You might be able to control a lot of variables in your life, but let me tell you, there's a couple things you can't defeat. Sin and death are two of them. Anyone tells you you're going to beat those is clearly lying to you. You need Jesus, and we should be desperate for him. If we would consider for a moment the weight of our sin, the consequences of our sinfulness, then it would make us very desperate indeed, coming to the King, knowing that we have actually nothing to offer, but we're only in a position to receive grace from him. And that desperation could drive us to faith. So let us know we are desperate, every single one of us. So let us come to Jesus with faith. Both come in a very desperate situation, and faith is the cure. It's not magic that cured the woman. It was her faith. It's faith that drove Jairus to Jesus, and it was faith that was tested by the mourners outside his house. Faith is what gives us access to Jesus and all of the goodness that he has for us. Now, the faith that we may bring may be little, may be at times flawed, but Jesus assured us over and over again, whatever little faith we have, it's enough. If we would just place that faith in his hands and see what he could do. In fact, one of my favorite things about these two stories being blended together is the contrast about who the woman is and who Jairus is. Because they're different in every single way. Jairus has all of the privilege in the world, right? First of all, he's a male, she's a female. Our society's still a little bit sexist, but you know what? It wasn't as sexist as it was then. That meant everything. Jairus has the advantage. Jairus is rich. He owns his own home. This woman has spent everything she has and is bankrupt. And Jairus has a family. At least when his daughter dies, people gather in his home to weep and wail along with him. Nobody cares what happens to this woman. Jairus is considered the religious elite, religiously clean and someone to follow after. She is an outcast and religiously unclean. They seem completely different in every single way, but there's two things they share in common. One is they're both desperate, and two, they both put their faith in Jesus. And that's all you and me need to be. It doesn't matter if you think you can come to Jesus with a whole lot this morning. You probably have less than you think you do. But what you really need is faith. Or if you're coming to Jesus this morning, you're saying, you know what, I have absolutely nothing but a little bit of flawed faith. You know what Jesus says? That is all you need. Let us come to Jesus with whatever faith we have and see what we can do so we can experience his salvation. As I highlighted throughout the passage, that word saved is never directly translated in the ESV, but it's used 3 times in the passage. In surprising ways. We would expect to read healed, but that's not the word that is used. These stories are supposed to point us to the greater salvation that Jesus brings. the greater salvation of a permanent freedom from all impurity, from all sickness, from all pain, and even from death. Faith allows us to access that. Faith allows us to experience that. And that when Jesus works these miracles, he gives us a little taste of what is to come. In fact, in reality, when we think about the hardships of our life and the times that we've prayed to God, whether the prayers are answered or unanswered should still drive us back to this great reminder that we need Jesus to come and to have full reign. Whenever Jesus answers a prayer and we receive that miracle, it is a reminder that is a taste of the good things to come. And we say, yes, Lord, come quickly. We need your reign here on earth. And when the answers are no, when we experience hardship, it is a reminder that we are indeed desperate for that full salvation of God. The salvation that comes when he returns to us, when all sickness, when all sin, and all pain, and even death is finally dealt with. Faith changes everything. And so as we close this morning, here's what I'd like us to do. I'd like to enter into a time of worship and invite us to bring whatever measure of faith we have to Jesus today. And so here's just something, you've probably noticed, obviously, the service was reversed and we're doing things a little bit differently. And so here's kind of why. I'm just kind of burdened for us as a pastor lately. That as I've looked at our church, I know for some of us, we would say, my faith has never been stronger. That I am walking with the Lord and I'm growing in my faith with him every day. And to that we say, yes and amen. What a blessing. But I know it's not true for all of us. In fact, I know for many of us, if we're not in a spiritual state of crisis, we are in some sort of state of spiritual drift. And our faith is being tested and our faith is being tried. And that we need this moment to come to Jesus. Some of you have expressed that to me. Others of you, I've actually gone to you and said, here's what I'm seeing, and you've confirmed that for me. For others of us, I know nothing's been said, and yet it is still true. And we need this moment to speak out in faith. And so what I want this to be a moment is where we can take our faith, whatever it is, and declare that we are putting that faith in Jesus to see what he can do in our lives. And so we're going to move into a time of worship. And again, it's inverted on purpose so that we can have all three songs at the end play together. A chance for us to come with whatever brokenness we have, whatever faith we have, and put that in Jesus' hands. And so don't come up yet, but in a moment, I'm going to change things, and I'm going to make us as uncomfortable as I can. Some of us are going to love this. Some of us are going to find it very uncomfortable. Let me tell you, sometimes being uncomfortable is a really good thing. To shake up the ordinariness of how we do worship. And so a moment, I'm going to be with the band on the stage. I'm going to call everyone actually to come to the front right here. All of us, out of our chairs, and we're going to be right here, the front row right here. That is now going to be the back row, okay? And everyone's going to gather around right here, and we're going to worship together. One of the reasons is like, we're a smaller church, and we've got the building here, and I think sometimes we feel too distant. And I think sometimes there's a powerful thing that happens when we hear each other sing, and we hear each other worship. Because we're reminded we're not alone. And that there are people around you who are just like you. A mixture of faith and fear and doubt. All coming together and taking what faith they have and trying to put it in Jesus' hand to see what he can do. Like, that's all of us. We all come desperate to the Lord, asking him for something and trying to put him in control. That is who we are. In fact, I'm going to encourage you this morning to sing loudly and to sing boldly, even if that singing is awful. My singing is awful and I've got a microphone, so don't even worry about it. I'm going to invite you actually to raise your hands. I know that we don't like doing that as a church, but actually, believe it or not, that's in the Bible. It constantly says, raise your holy hands in worship. It's not a metaphor. It's a posture of worship. It's a reminder that you are coming to the King as a beggar. Not able to offer anything to him, but only able to receive. That's what that posture means as we raise our hands. And let us sing with passion. The songs that I have selected for this moment are intentionally chosen for us to state our faith in Jesus. The first song we're going to sing is Blessed Be Your Name. That's taken out of the life of Job. God gives and he takes away, and yet no matter if it's the good season or the bad season, we should say, blessed be your name, O Lord. That we would surrender ourselves to him in every situation of life. May we pray that as we sing it, and may we mean it. The second song is going to be Heart of Worship. It's not about the singing. It's not about the things that we can give to God. In fact, really, we have nothing. The heart of worship is when God has our heart. And as we sing that, let us pray that. I want to come back to that heart of worship where all I am saying is, Jesus, I want you to have all of me. We'll have a moment there where I'll read a prayer for us to kind of acknowledge together about Christ being the center of our lives. And then we'll finish with one last song, which is Christ Be Magnified. It's a little bit newer to us. We've sang it a couple times. But that should be the prayer of our life again. Christ be magnified in my life. And the reason I really selected that song, though, and the reason I love it is because of the bridge. That speaks about the hardship and the suffering, and yet the commitment we need to have towards God. It says, I won't bow to idols. I'll stand strong and worship you. That we think of idols as statues, and maybe we're not worried about, but there's a lot of idols in our lives. A lot of things that would pull us away from Jesus because that's the thing that we think we really want. Let's say, I won't bow to those. I will bow to Jesus and Jesus alone. He says, I won't follow my feelings, but I will follow what is true. Now, for so many people, like they get wrapped up in what they feel. I feel this is okay, so it must be okay. Instead of following what is actually truth and what God has actually said to us. He speaks about suffering, and he says, if I join you in your suffering, I will join you when I rise. That anytime we suffer, and we suffer well for Jesus, we join in his suffering, all the more assured that when he returns, we will join him and we will worship him forever. And in the meantime, we want to magnify him with our lives. And so we're going to be singing, we're going to be worshiping. In addition to that, I want to invite you to say, hey, if there's anything else you need to do this morning and take to God, to do it. Maybe you've got some sin in your life and you need to confess that to God. You know what? He already knows about it. You might as well just bring it to him. Maybe you've got some doubt and some spiritual drift. Just bring that to God. He already knows about it. You might as well invite him in to speak in that. For others of us, maybe we've got some anger at God, anger at church. You might as well confess that to God. He already knows. Let us put that in his hands and see what he does with that. So I invite you to actually pray those prayers even as we sing and worship. If you would like someone to pray for you, we will have that available as well. So Cindy and Steve and Kevin, go ahead and raise your hand. They know who you are, but just so you know, they're going to be in that what's the new back row, which is the front row. They're going to be back there, and they are ready to pray for you. And so if you would like prayer for anything this morning, just go ahead and go to them and ask for that. If you have something you would like to confess, you can confess to them. They're safe people to confess to. And they might also be, there's going to be praying and singing and worshiping. Maybe their hands are raised too. It's okay. Just tap them on the shoulder. They want to pray for you. Go ahead and interrupt their worship. That is what they are hoping is going to happen. And so this is your opportunity to connect with God. To say, you know what, I'm drifting no longer, but Lord, I'm coming back to you. So now I'm going to invite the band to come back up. And I'm going to invite all of you to come down here. Let's pray together as we enter into this time of worship. Father, I thank you that you sent your Jesus to bring us the fullness of salvation that we do not deserve and that we could not earn. I thank you that we have an opportunity to put our faith in him, whatever amount of faith we have, and to experience the goodness that you have for us. I'm asking, Father, I've been praying for this moment all week, and I'm asking that you would use it now. Use it in our hearts to help us worship as we have never worshiped before, to connect with you as we have never connected before. We are here for you, and we want to commit our lives into your hands through the good and the bad alike as it comes. We ask you would move amongst us in this time. Amen.